Welcome. I'm Carl Bodner, and I'm pleased to host another edition of the Massac Report. Today, I'm joined by three student panelists who will share in our discussion about the rising occurrence of mass public killings with both weapons and vehicles. Our panelists are Gretchen Banofsky, to my immediate right, Josh Wittenberger, opposite me at the table, and Catherine Simonek. It is a fact that violent crime rates are lower than ever, while the number of mass shootings and mass public killings is rising at a steady rate. This crisis is magnified by the fact that the U.S. has 5% of the world's population and yet accounts for 31% of the global mass shooters and vehicular killers in the world. I would like each of you, as panelists, to share your thoughts about why this is happening. So Josh, I'm going to impose on you first. Why do you think, what information do you possess to help explain why we're seeing this remarked increase in public killing?
Well, I don't think we'll ever really know why, because motives are always different, and in most cases the killers actually kill themselves after they commit the crime, so I don't know if we'll ever really understand why these horrible things are happening at a full extent, but we make pretty good assumptions and inferences about how they're happening and why they're happening, and I think we're doing a good job of trying to stop them.
And what about you, Catherine?
Well, I agree with that. There's so many factors that go along with this that I feel like you can't really pinpoint it onto one thing, and that's why it's hard to really ever know why it is happening. But I think that there are things that we can do in order to not allow this to continue to happen, or at least keep it a constant, if you know what I mean. Because I feel like as a nation, we tend to want to get to this end. We want to fix the problem, get to this end, but we don't think about the steps in the middle. And we need to take little steps to get it to a constant so that we can work to decrease the rate that it's currently at of mass killings. And a couple factors, main factors, even though there's a ton that I think are causing this to happen, is first off, ISIS's need for publicity and wanting to regain their ground, because they've been losing their ground recently. And one of the things you gave us, it says that they had just recently in the past few weeks lost all their territory in the Middle East. So I think it's just their way to get fame and regain that ground and show people that they should be afraid of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it really reflects upon the intensities of the long-term violence we've been engaged with in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. But when we look at certain things like the previous church in Texas, we don't see a Middle East connection, I don't think. And, you know, so what is going on that it's expanding beyond the scope of our determination to see everything as a cause-effect relationship. And from what you and Josh are saying, you're talking about causes and effects. Mm-hmm. But Gretchen, what do you think?
Well, I think not only, I agree completely that there are multiple causes to the mass shootings and also vehicular terrorism in itself. And while ISIS is a factor and other terrorist acts such as that and the ones that ISIS commits, it could also be a factor, like you said, with the Texas shooting, how there was no connection. It could be that people are copying previous terrorists and they might just have no motive at all, or they could have mental health issues. But in an article referenced, it said like the CDC cannot legally diagnose terrorists with mental health issues, so it's hard to really know if there has been anything going on or why these people are copying previous acts of terrorism.
I mean, this is something that previous generations, let's just say going back 4 to 5 years ago, there was nowhere the same amount of these kind of violent actions taking place. And now your generation is hearing about it on a regular basis, almost month by month, sometimes week by week. And even when we look at the Newtown shooting, you know, we can't just put the blame there on outside America, but something's happening within America. I'm wondering, do you think there's been a more willfulness to be tolerant of violence in America now?
Well, it seems like we're almost growing accustomed to it. It's like every day on the news you hear, oh, another person dies of a mass shooting, another person attempts one of these crimes. But I don't know, it's just, we're creating a culture of it, and I think we need to make sure that it stays that, oh, this is that horrific, so it's seen that, oh, it's just stay away from it almost.
What are your
Yeah.
thoughts?
I definitely think the big difference between past generations and our generation is social media, and that is bringing more awareness to these things. Like Josh said, we're seeing it every day, like you said, every week, every month. We're seeing these things, and we become almost immune to the violence. It's like how that in one of the packets you gave us talked about the conservative view, blaming it on the violence seen in movies and video games. It's kind of like you see that every day, and it's almost like, well, if I do it, what's the difference? Like, that's awful to say, but I feel like that's part of the mindset that these killers have. And the things like, we see it. We see the death happening on like Facebook Live, awful atrocities like that we've witnessed on the news, and just, you know, sitting on our phone trying to enjoy our day on Facebook, but you get a Facebook Live of someone shooting someone or killing someone.
What are you thinking?
And not only like does it desensitize us as Americans to all this violence that's happening, and it also opens up these ideas to potential mass murderers, because they see it all the time on social media, and then they feel inclined to copy previous crimes. And I think it also ties into legislation in America, because an article I read had said that for some reason, after mass shootings, gun control legislation is actually decreased in certain states rather than tightened, and it makes it it's accessible for people to buy machine guns and different other kinds of dangerous assault weapons, whether it be at a rifle convention or from a store. It's very easy to get your hands on a gun that could be very dangerous, and I think that also has something to do with social media.
I believe it was 2 years ago, there was a gun show in Las Vegas, and a father brought his 8-year-old son, and somehow the boy managed to pick up one of the weapons and started firing it, and the gun was heavy and he couldn't really control it. But, you know, it's kind of glamorous. I mean, if we've done anything, I would suggest we're glamorizing violence. And that is very disturbing to me. And it's not like we didn't in the past. I mean, you go back to TV westerns in the 50s and 60s, you know, the John Wayne bursting into the saloon and guns of flame, you know, flame that are just shooting away. But who was the good guy and bad guy was easier to understand. And eventually, as the film went on, you got to figure out, well, what was the motive here, if there was a motive. But nowadays, it seems very different from that. But we still seem to glamorize, my argument is we still seem to glamorize the violence. And I find that disturbing, and I find it diminishes people's outlook as a positive outlook of hope for the future. And I worry about that as a teacher, as a person, as a grandfather. You know, is this, if this is going to continue, my goodness, what will it be like? And especially when we see it happening in public schools, we see it happening at university campuses like Virginia Tech. All of these things are discouraging, disappointing, and we're going to have to look upon this in a different context if we're going to resolve anything. But allow me to go to my second question, okay? Respond to this. a Harvard School of Public Health states that between 2011 and 2014, public attacks occurred every 64 days. Now, what impression does that make on your mind? Anyone can speak first, I'm okay.
Well, it's scary to think that it happens every 64 days because eventually, probability takes its, the equation, whatever it is, and maybe someday it'll happen really close to you, maybe it happen to you, because eventually time catches up to people, and that's a scary thought.
Right.
What about Gretchen?
Oh, and there's just so many shootings, and you never know when the next one is going to be.
Exactly.
Or where?
Or where, right. So, like, what happened recently in Manhattan with vehicular terrorism also, like, that's very close to here, and you never know where you're safe in the country anymore and what places, because shootings have happened everywhere, on university campuses, in school, in regular public schools, in movie theaters, just out in public, all over, and you don't know where you're safe anymore.
In many cases, too, the person committing the act of violence is a young person,
Yes.
and which, which really puzzles me more, because when you said becoming immune, that's a very frightful immunity to have coming along.
Definitely, it's terrifying, and it's just the fact that it happens that frequent. I feel like, as we've been seeing recently with the news, like what happened in New York and in Texas, I feel like it might become more frequent. As scary as that sounds, just with vehicular terrorism,
Definitely.
like you were saying, because it requires no planning. You just get in a car and go.
We had that Vegas incident in, what was it, a couple weeks after you have the Manhattan, and then a couple days after you have the Texas. It's speeding up. It's
Insane.
becoming more
It's more
often.
frequent than 64 days now,
Yeah.
definitely.
And there is,
It's getting
as you
scarier.
indicated, a copycat syndrome that
Right.
seems to go along with some of this, and that is frightful. I mean, something becomes an act of violence becomes an inspiration for me to try to commit a better act of violence.
Yeah.
Not just bigger, but better.
Yeah, that's where I feel like the social media plays that part, because they are seeing this happening, and people who may be sitting back having these same intentions, they may have not acted upon it, but then they're seeing everyone else doing this, and they're just probably more fired up and like ready to do it. Like, well, if they can do it, I can do it, type of thing.
And the victims are all at random. I mean,
Yeah.
there's children, young people, old people, every walk of life, and it's not like you could say, all right, you've got the gray uniform on in the Civil War, and I've got the blue one,
Yeah.
and the line of demarcation is clear. But there is no line of demarcation here. The other thing that I find frightening, and I don't know if you've had any thoughts of this, is how frequently these things get tied to different religions.
Right.
Yes,
And the
that's wrong.
religion becomes a validation, yet just about all religions have some stated opposition to taking the life of someone. So have you had that thought?
About religion?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think as our president, he stereotyped Muslims. Well, the Muslim religion is totally against any violence or anything along those matters. But we see these Middle Eastern people doing this violence. Not just Middle Eastern people anymore, it's United States citizens that are doing these acts of violence, and we're just stereotyping into one group, and that's wrong. You have to think everybody has the chance to do it, but you can't live in the fear of that either, as people are. They're thinking, oh, well, I see that person on boarding the same plane as me. I don't want to board the plane. That just can't happen. It's wrong.
You have to avoid being paranoid.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the stereotyping is just inevitable, unfortunately. I feel like it's just people have that ability just to think that when they see someone, even if we don't want to admit it. I feel like a lot of us do that, and I feel like that the stereotyping, it just is an excuse. I feel like it's human nature to want to give an excuse and make an excuse for yourself that reassures you and calms you down as to why this is happening. Because I feel like we don't really have a concrete set answer for why it's happening, so I feel like that's why a lot of us give these stereotypes as an excuse towards like religion, like blaming religion in certain groups of people.
Right.
People fear what they don't know. It's like when the monster under your bed, you don't know if anything's down there. That's why you're afraid of it. We don't know anything really about the mental state of these individuals, so that's why we fear it.
Do you think, since we don't know anything about like the mental state and like, this goes along with stereotyping like as well, do you think like a better like intervention to maybe try to prevent some more mass shootings would be like more accessibility to mental health institutions for people at risk of having like a shooter's qualities?
Well, I know that the government is taking away money from mental health institutions it was many, many years ago, but Fairfield Hills,
Right.
that shut down. I feel like that was wrong to shut it down because those people didn't go to different hospitals. They went
They just
back
went on
onto the streets.
Right.
And maybe, I hate to say it, but maybe some of them weren't stable enough to have an active role in society. They
Right.
needed that wall to separate them because they weren't ready for it.
Right.
I don't think it'll necessarily help it that much because I had done some research on this myself, and only, I don't know the exact percentage, but a very small percentage of mass killers showed any sign of having any mental disability. And yes, I do think that it's a good outcome of this conflict we're having, is that if you do increase the mental health care for people, it'll help those people, but I don't think it'll affect the mass killing population that much. And even if it did, some people are probably in denial and don't want to admit or reach out that they have a problem, because in order for them to utilize that mental health care, they need to go and use it.
Very true.
They have to be
Very
identified.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
Right.
potential is there.
And I think part of that, like identification, goes along with families. Like I know in I think it was this article, it talked about Adam Lanza's mother and how she had never really been concerned about his mental condition before, obviously, he...
And she was the one who
Yeah.
purchased the guns.
Right.
Yeah, but she kept them, she didn't lock them up, which was wrong.
Right.
But that, you can't control that.
Now, here's the next point to this initial question. When we look at this data that we've just discussed, and we have to ask ourselves, I suggest, that we should look upon this as a health epidemic, that this is becoming an epidemic. And just like with a natural disaster or an epidemic, government must take some vigilant action, some vigilant steps. Okay, would that comparison make sense in your thinking, that this is an epidemic?
Definitely. I think it definitely does, just because it's like you have a health epidemic killing tons of people in a short span of time. This is what this is becoming. And I feel like it is such a dire issue. Like with an epidemic, health epidemic, you want to go and find a cure as fast as you possibly can to kind of backtrack and bring it back and cure what's happening. We need to find that cure that's going to aid us in decreasing these rates, because it's like, but the thing is, like say when Indians and settlers came and disease broke out and tons of Indians died from disease, that wasn't cured in one day. You had a span of time, they weren't just immune in one day. You had a span of time where they had to try and fix this problem, come up with cures, just like for smallpox, the plague, all that. So here, we need to come up with this cure, but we need to realize that it's not going to happen in one day. But we need to act now, like if it is a health epidemic.
And all the public is at risk.
Yeah.
I don't think you should treat it as a health epidemic, because in a health epidemic, you try to isolate the virus. And how could you isolate something that is so sporadic? I wouldn't be able to comprehend it as an epidemic or something like a disease. It's different than that. It's more, I don't even know, words are too paltry to understand it.
Well, a virus doesn't predetermine,
Exactly, it doesn't
Right.
premeditate. It doesn't look out for specific targets and specific spots. Viruses just act, whomever it is. But this is different because people are actually thinking about it. They're doing it, and they're doing it very well. I hate to say it. They're really doing a good job of what they think their job is to do. But it should not be an epidemic, because epidemics are, I don't feel like that would be the correct word to use.
Well, and you're just making me think, and I believe there's a connection here. When you look at the First Baptist Church in Texas, the shooting there, some of the indicators suggest that he was looking to his in-law family, and that his mother-in-law attended that church, but she didn't happen to be there that day. But there was this somehow personalized motivation, and I think that's one of the things that overwhelms me, that this is such a personalized action that the person can lie to themselves and validate doing what they're doing. And that's a scary thought to me.
You can make yourself do anything if you want to if you believe in it.
So we can take that which is irrational, and because we have our thought processes, turn it into something that in our mind becomes rational.
Yeah.
That's scary.
Right.
Yeah.
So does that go back to the mental health aspect, I wonder?
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it does.
I believe so too.
Definitely, I think that's how the stigma comes about, is because we want, like I said before, we want that excuse. We want to believe that these people have a mental illness so that we kind of seclude ourselves from this population and be like, this is one person, like one group of people that is responsible for this. But that's just, I feel like, findings, in fact, that's just not true or coming to be true.
It's so randomized.
I mean, I'd hate to say it, but it could be a hereditary thing. You know, how alcoholism is a brain set that is hereditary and has been proven a disease that is hereditary. Same thing like diabetes or something along those lines. So maybe they could prove it somehow that it is a hereditary mindset in your brain that makes you want to commit violence.
Right. I wonder, like, because there's different addictions. You can get addicted to a lot of things. Like, you can get addicted to sugar, and there's also, like, obviously a drug addiction. But I'm wondering if you can get addicted to violence, and that's why these things happen. So maybe these people see violence all the time on social media, and they get addicted to it, and then eventually they try it out themselves in a mass shooting.
Well, another thing that bothers me, relevant to comments you've all been making, is we take many acts of violence and not only glamorize them, but categorize them in our economy and in our thinking as entertainment. I mean, you watch some of these wrestling things where, one guy beats another guy over the head with a chair, and the guy just jumps up and fights back. That's not going to happen.
No, that's not.
If I come and hit you over the head with a folded metal chair, I don't think you're going to be bouncing back up. And yet you've got middle-aged men taking their 8, 9, and 10-year-old sons, and it seems to me it's going to have some kind of an effect.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it becomes entertainment. Unfortunately, even legalized violence like football. I mean, I coached football, I played football, I love the game, but it's violent. And, people just thrive. Hockey, same thing. Thrive on me slamming you into the boards.
Yeah.
And so I'm not so sure if we're getting out of control. I mean, that's something I can't figure out. Let's move on to another concern. Do you think that some increase in gun control legislation can cause a reduction in this escalating crisis?
I did some reading on this, and I do not believe an increase in gun control legislation would actually stop the mass shooting crisis, at least in a generalization. So if it were to be federal legislation and it were to try to tackle all different types of mass shootings at once, then I don't believe that a general gun control law that would restrict it nationwide would be effective in helping to stop mass shootings. Although I do think that either tweakings in laws or stricter laws state by state would help, depending on each state's current policies.
But you have an interesting situation with the shooter in Texas, recent shooter in Texas, where he was discharged dishonorably from the Air Force. Technically, he should have been flagged when he went and bought weapons, but unfortunately, the Air Force failed to notify the FBI, so his name would be on record. And, you know, guns are just excessively
Right.
available in America. We're a very armed nation.
No.
I mean, I would dread to think if we ever had a second Civil War, we killed off 900,000 of ourselves back then
Right.
Yeah.
with muskets. God only knows what we would do today,
Right.
you know.
Well,
And with the accessibility of like machine guns nowadays,
The
it
automatic
really,
weapons.
Right, automatic weapons really puts a question on like the Second Amendment. Like, since they didn't have such powerful guns back then when the Constitution was written, did the Founding Fathers ever intend for there to be like such accessibility to such mass weapons of destruction?
Well, I mean, the Second Amendment really doesn't say the people have the right to bear arms and use it at their will. It says, I'm quoting this, being necessary to keep the security of the free state. This is not securing the free state. It's actually taking people's lives, which is a right we're given in the Constitution, is life, liberty, and property. And giving people guns for their own pleasure is not, that doesn't say anything in the Constitution. It's to regulate a militia, not to use for your own play.
Yeah, I feel like
Right.
that's where people argue, saying you can interpret the Constitution and all that. But I definitely agree that I don't think much, enforcing legislation will do much, because as you had mentioned before, that when things like this happen, we tend to loosen the gun legislation laws that we create. And it's very, and we even said in the packet, it said that they're inadequate. And they are inadequate because I feel like people, they harp on background checks. I'm going to bring up background checks. They harp on background checks constantly, saying, oh, we need to make them better and all that. But the thing is, I don't think it's a matter of making them better. They might be good. It's just that we're not putting them to use because of the fact that people can go to these gun shows.
Right.
You can buy a gun from your family member, your friend, your neighbor. I feel like making more laws and not tackling this issue is not going to change anything, because you can still go out and get one. If a person wants a gun, they're going to go get a gun. That's
And
just
there's
how I
also
see
a
it.
They can find a
huge
way.
illegal gun market out there,
Yes.
Exactly.
which will never be, I can't imagine us ever being able to manage that,
No.
to be truthful. But I think we have to, if we are to legislate, I think we have to make one big decision, and it's going to be a political argument. Should it be state by state, or should it be a national program?
Right.
And that political argument has to be put to rest, and I'm not so sure what the resolutions for doing that could possibly be, but that's going to be something.
Yeah, you see, you bring up the political aspect of it. That was one of my main points here, is that I feel like another problem we have before we can solve this problem is that we bring every kind of issue like this to politics, and then it becomes a greater conflict there, and then nothing gets done. Because I feel like bringing something like this to politics, it just, with gun laws and all, it just divides us farther as a people. And during this time, we don't need this division while people are distraught and need reconciliation with what's happening. We don't need that division. I feel like political parties need to come to a compromise together in order to tackle this, or try to tackle it and see how it works, instead of fighting against each other, backing down for a while, and letting it continue happen as they continue to try and fight for years on end.
And ironically, from what I've read and what I've seen on what I call legitimate journalistic media, and to me, when I think of that, I think of things like PBS. You know, a lot of the commercial networks I don't think cover anything in depth.
Mm-hmm.
But every time an event occurs, from what the data shows, is the sale of guns actually goes up, because people are thinking about protecting themselves and their families. And that isn't an understandable response, but an unfortunate response.
Yes.
So, all right, let's ask each of you to share your thoughts about vehicular terrorism. Okay, what do you think's brought on this insanity? Because it's global.
Well, with the gun legislation, people, I mean, it's not constraining them from getting guns, but people think, oh, can't get a gun that way now, so why don't I try this a different way? Vehicular terrorism. And vehicular terrorism, I don't know how you could stop that. I mean, people have the keys to a car. There's no way you could, put up barriers from sidewalks and bike lanes, but then that constrains other, I don't know any way you could stop that, because you could be walking down the street, somebody could crash their car into you. There's no way you could stop that.
It's very random.
And
Yeah.
also, like, with vehicular terrorism, it's so much quicker for whether it's someone entering the U.S. and wanting to commit an act of terrorism, or an already citizen who is not a gun owner. It's easy for them to either already own a vehicle, because obviously vehicles are practical, or rent a truck or other car and do whatever they want with it.
Or steal one.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you're
It's
aware,
so
in
much easier.
Connecticut, we've had a rampage, particularly in the New Canaan, Darien, Stamford, Greenwich area, where for whatever reason, people leave their car unlocked with a key inside, and then teenagers have been stealing them like crazy.
Happened in my neighborhood.
And they found a dozen recent ones where they drove them up into Waterbury somewhere and just left them.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, you got to be a little sensible about this. You know, it's like, don't weigh that temptation in front of you. So I think we've got what appears almost to be lunacy.
Yeah, going off what you guys said, there's not much I feel you can do. You can't ban these cars. You can't ban cars from people. But as I was reading the articles you had given about what happened in New York and all, it was kept mentioning the same type of car. It was like kind of overshadowing that it was a pattern they were seeing, that there was the same type of car that they tend to have been using. So like that makes me think, do you think maybe they'd not ban cars, maybe ban some type of model of car, maybe have, when you rent a car, that whole process, I'm not sure how they do it, but if maybe make things stricter with how they rent it out to people, with background checks for them maybe for renting a car.
That would be interesting if we get to the point where we're background checking
Right.
Yeah.
the car you rent, the car you
Right.
buy.
It's sad to
You
think,
think
but
of,
like,
you think
I
of
feel like
car
it'd be a
rentals as
possibility.
so simple, like
Yeah.
when
Enterprise will
yeah.
pick you up.
Right.
Oh my gosh, that brings a whole new thing to the table. I don't know that we want to go that direction.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad. I don't know. It's what I think of. Sadly.
Well, yeah, it is sad, but it's understandable that you would have some of these thoughts. You know, and on the economic level of it, you take a look at New York City last New Year's. I mean, there were 100 officer vehicles blocking intersections, and they had several hundred garbage trucks and sand trucks just to secure that area. And it cost the city over $600,000 to accomplish that action for procuring safety in Times Square. And that's just overwhelming in my thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe what have to do.
I mean, years ago, you worried mostly about the pickpockets.
Right.
That seems
And
so,
now you're worried
so,
I know.
Yeah.
so
Trivial, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm laughing at that.
Right.
That just.
It's
Right.
pickpocketing.
All right, this has been, I think, not only identifying and sharing comments about the globality of this problem. It's not just in America, and it's not just against America. So I think some of the points that the three of you have provided are very useful, very thoughtful, and we are going to have to take a very serious look, be realistic. We're not going to be able to just eliminate guns. We're not going to be able to eliminate somebody with a sense of vigilance in their mind and heart from driving into pedestrians, as was recently happened in New York. You know, and that was right near Manhattan, which is the most affluent area in the city. So I think, you know, it's really become a problem. And what I think we need to do is get dialogue going. And this is something that has to come into classrooms, both in the high school and in the colleges. You know, and we have to spare the youngest kids, but if nothing is done within some reasonable mode of time politically, will the present fifth graders see an additional 30% increase? And as a teacher, that is something I would hope isn't going to happen. So allow me to thank you for sharing this time today, and allow me to thank the audience, because it makes a big difference for us to have our voices heard. So we'll look forward to a future MASIC report. We hope you'll be given some consideration and thought to joining us for another topic. And I think that, you know, it's going to generate, I hope for any of our audience we have, conversation. And the more conversation opens up about it, the better we might come across some ideas that can resolve the sadness and tragedy of these kinds of events. So thank you again, Josh. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Gretchen. Okay, and to the audience, we wish you well and have a good day.